ChatGPT. I'm sure everyone has heard of this. I guess the title of the talk will be ChatGPT, a new frontier for healthcare. I'm going to slightly update that this morning and make that ChatGPT and generative AI. And just as a quick introduction, I know it was briefly mentioned, I'm currently the Chief Fellow of Body Imaging at Stanford Radiology. I'm also the nationally selected Informatics Fellow at the American College of Radiology. And this is my contact information, and I'll show it again at the end. So some financial disclosures. I have no financial disclosures, unfortunately. In July, I will become the Director of Innovation at UMI, which is the University of Maryland Medical Intelligent Imaging Center. So just to give some context of what we're going to be discussing, I think this is a really hot topic. It's a very new topic. Some of the things I'll be saying, I'm not a computer scientist, so I'm going to be trying to do it at a very basic level for radiologists and for radiology trainees to understand. So what is generative AI and ChatGPT, and why is it important to us? Generally speaking, people have tried to think about artificial intelligence as just a computational way of thinking about what intelligence is, right? And if we define this as this box here, there's three different kind of categories of what this looks like for what we define intelligence to be. So if we consider artificial narrow intelligence, general intelligence, and superintelligence, those are the three categories. We generally are mostly currently in this category here, narrow intelligence, where we're thinking about machine learning. We're doing mostly specific tasks in one area problem. You make an algorithm, you build a model, you do that one thing. And it's mostly enhancing jobs. For the other categories, though, this is where innovation is kind of growing towards, right? So artificial general intelligence is where machine intelligence, right, can be as smart as a human, earning a degree, confusing humans, it is human. So this is where people start getting worried about their jobs being at risk. And I put question marks in here because previously it was predicted that this would happen in 2040. More recently, people started talking about it being as early as 2030. We'll discuss a little bit more about why that is. And then artificial superintelligence, where you start thinking about Skynet, where the machine's conscious and it's much smarter than the best humans in every field. I think this is just a general overview to get us that context to think about what it means for us in radiology, but also just for our society in general. So briefly, this is a paper out from Nature Review Cancer in 2018, where it had briefly looked at AI tools right inside of radiology, either in the workflow or in image-based, pixel-based tasks, such as detection, characterization, and monitoring. So just to give a clear example, where the output of the AI is generally classifications, and I put predictions in quotes because it generally is from a mathematical standpoint in terms of predicting like how accurate it is in predicting that next thing. Like if it's able to predict that you have that pneumonia, it's not truly a real prediction. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But then as we're progressing towards machine intelligence, this is where generative AI is really taking off, right? The output is no longer just classifying things that already exist, or if you give it the blueberry versus chihuahua and you give it a new chihuahua, at least it's still categorizing things into chihuahuas. Here, you're asking it to do something completely different. You're giving it either text input where you say, draw me this generative AI picture, or you say, I need you to make a whole PowerPoint presentation for me. And it takes that input and is able to generate new content that didn't exist before. Question marks on whether or not that certain areas of those things are copyrightable, or if it's using content that was not, that's considered plagiarized in some way, shape, or form. But that's for an ethical debate that we won't touch on too much. But it's just, generally speaking, generative AI is why there's so much interest now in thinking about machine learning, but now progressing towards machine intelligence. So this helps us think about outside of this bubble here. So this is a drawing from the UN Development Report Office in 2022. So initially people will think about tasks that humans can do and human tasks that can be automated. So maybe, again, discussing, does that really augment your job or take it away? And really, we want to focus on thinking about something completely different, right? Are there new tasks altogether that humans can do with the help of machines? What is a 10x version of you? What would your job look like if things suddenly just were taken off of your plate? And so really thinking about generative AI and ChatGPT in that context. So currently, we as humans generally would need programming skills, right, in order to code programming applications in AI. I'm just very, again, surface level glossing this over, but generally speaking, that's what you would need to do. And then you'd have to deploy it in some way, shape, or form in order for that action to be applied. And then that kind of goes backwards for in a feedback loop, and you kind of iterate on your code. So that's the current landscape. And given that, what would the future look like given that we've got these new tools in place? And you have now the human who has this idea or some kind of thing that they want to implement. And so instead of needing programming skills, you now are thinking to yourself, why don't I just say I need XYZ, right? I need a radiology report generated. You would use your natural English language or other language and express that to some kind of generative AI or a large, in this case, it would ChatGPT is a large language model. And you would that would automatically generate code or generate backend information, right? That would either hook into APIs or other things to then be able to be directly applied. And you could iterate and engineer those prompts or inputs to get better and better outputs. And that kind of erases a whole bunch of work. Again, this is a very high level version of this. This is obviously not already in place, but it's moving in that direction. And I think it helps us think about what could be possible with this kind of future. So right now, there's a lot of interest and money going towards generative AI. This is one of many visuals to look at how generative AI has been changing. So this is all the different buckets that people have considered investing into. And this is like in terms of visual media, I'm sure you've heard of DALL-E and other tools that have generated really interesting images, text-based things, generative interfaces, human-machine interfaces, speech and audio encoding. This was back in 2021 to 2022. Definitely will have changed because everything seems to change even from a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. So now diving a little deeper, just specifically into ChatGPT and large language models, right? This is an example of what training data would look like. You would get a sentence like Python is a programming, and then the prediction here of what that word would be. And so that you can imagine a list of words it would generate and which one would be the most accurate. And this is just expressing that the probability of these words being accurate is in the context of this sentence is the important piece, right? You could predict all sorts of things based on just this one preceding word, but what about the entire context of this sentence or even the entire context of the paragraph or things that you're requesting? And that's a huge leap forward in terms of technology and understanding, because I'm sure you've tried this before in your text messages or the things where it starts not quite understanding what you need after the fact. And this context is really important for how ChatGPT works and why large language models are huge, because you need a huge bulk of training data. So you can remember something like Mad Libs. You can imagine like a whole bucket of these Mad Libs being put in where things are just kind of blanked out throughout, and they kind of re-blank out different sections of words, and they just keep on predicting and keep on training themselves on huge corpuses of data. So think of this, they call them tokens, billions of tokens, right? Imagine this equation out into the billions, which is really ridiculous and amazing, but it happens. And so here it then generates, so this equation, right, kind of gets created on the order of billions and now trillions. I'm using billions here because of ChatGPT 3.5, but on ChatGPT 4, I think it is in the trillions. So here you have the generative pre-trained transformer, which underlies the large language model. And then you get completed prompts and outputs. So in this case, Python as a programming language, right, would be your completed prompt. And then the important thing underlying that is that there's a numeric representation of that text, right? They call them embeddings. Just imagine that all of this information is somehow hard-coded into more of a numeric setting that can be translated to other settings. So on top of ChatGPT, GPT 3.5, right, there's a chatbot interface that then becomes ChatGPT 3.5. So none of us have to be coding into this piece. Other people that have large companies have done this piece, but they provided this chatbot for us to be interacting with it. And so imagine now, instead of language, you have and text, you have images, speech, other data, sensors and 3D signals, right? And you have other types of foundation that can then feed forward into building other foundation models that might not be language, it may be very multimodality type of models, and then can do many different tasks aside from just generating text. And this really is why there's been such interest in investing in generative AI and thinking about its potentials. So here you can see that there's been such an exponential increase with larger and larger models. Moore's law, if you've heard of it before, right? Like things will double and triple and exponentially increase. And you can see here that ChatGPT 4 is way out here already in terms of how many parameters it has compared to everything else that's come before it. And I'm sure this will keep expanding as we go. So again, GPT-4 is now in the trillions, and it, instead of where ChatGPT 3 and 3.5 are text only, GPT-4 is multimodal, where it can take text and imaging, video and sound, which I can't even imagine just generating videos just for straight off of my computer. That would have taken teams and hours and days, years of time, but now this is overnight, in theory, doable. So this is another data point, and I think this is something that startled me when I saw it, and then it made me reflect on how things were adopted. So I think I'm getting to the point where I'm like, I'm still, in training and I'm finishing that, but I'm realizing like, hey, I'm a little bit old and that I remember things like the dial-up internet, right? And how long it took for people to even know what Google was and try to find Google search before they were using like Dogpile and Yahoo and other things. And as people become more facile with using and adopting things that are useful to them, ChatGPT just immediately jumped to the top there. And you can imagine with more and more generative AI tools, what things are we going to use immediately that we won't even think about not using, right? Like Google became such a part of the fabric of what I've been doing. I've realized recently that I need to dig through pages of Google image data or pages of Google search to get to what I actually need, whereas ChatGPT gives it to me immediately. And I would think that in the future that would be archaic to have to dig through so many things to build a presentation, and it would be pretty immediate in the future. So then we can now focus, now that we have that background, right, on use cases and pitfalls in radiology and healthcare. And I'm just going to pause and think about that, let people percolate on what we had just discussed before I move forward, because I know that was a lot. So just giving this brief moment to think about this statement where AI won't replace radiologists, but radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. I think even more starkly with the generations that have seen internet and now different technologies advance in society and now affecting our workplaces, that this is even more real and more prevalent in how it's affecting our future. So it's not just those classifiers anymore, it's going to be this generative AI. So radiology, luckily, has been medicine's tech early adopters. So we've always been embracing new technologies and approaches to medicine. So as you can see, I think we've always been the first ones to adopt things and take advantage of new technologies. And even now at the FDA, radiology encompasses about a little over 70% of new approved, cleared or exempt AI tools compared to every other specialty. So I think we have a leading edge, and that's really great. Here now, thinking about that thing we discussed earlier is healthcare data, right? So in place of all these types of data, what pieces of this can you think of within healthcare? So for example, that electronic medical record, imaging data, video visits, maybe even transcribing visits, sensors within the ED or elsewhere, all of those inputs, right, can underlie potentially new foundation models. Do we need a medical specific foundation model, or can we just tweak current models and kind of add training data? And what kind of tasks can be done based on that? So this is a slide that was shown at the prior ACR Informatics Summit by Dr. Geraldine McGinty, and it was just thinking about the different buckets of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So pre-analytic, analytic, and post-analytic. There's been many ways of thinking about this, but basically, how do radiologists do their work, and which pieces, right, can be either automated, augmented, and removed from needing to be done. So for example, when they're selecting tests, right, and they need clinical decision support, or they're ordering something and they don't know what to do, in theory, right, it would be seamless. It would be less painful. It would be automatically done. None of those clicks, right? It would just automatically be recognized as a default to do certain things. And I think it's attempted to be automated in a way that makes sense, but it lacks that ability now. But we could be moving in that direction, communicating toward with patients, with cancer screening follow-ups, with recommendations that are automatically put in our reports. Are there reminders that are sent? Are there better ways to communicate? As I'm sure you've seen in the news, that it was seen that patients who interacted with a chatbot that doesn't run out of time, can repeat things, can re-explain things in different ways at different reading levels and different languages, are much better at communication in some ways than just sitting with a physician for 15 minutes. And I'm saying some ways because I think there needs to be physician oversight, we really need to think about that. But that's another area we can think about, and et cetera, et cetera. But I'm focusing on this area just because I think this is most immediately pressing in that it's already being used in that way. I think if you haven't heard of already, your colleagues are already asking ChatGPT to kind of summarize patient reports, and patients are already asking for ChatGPT for advice. The rest of this, I think, is more under our umbrella. We have more ways to drive this, but this is definitely something to keep an eye on. So again, this falls into the buckets of interpretive versus non-interpretive AI. So really consider things including error and harm reduction and time and cost savings, et cetera, and really open to thinking about how we can innovate in this space. So this is in a paper that is hopefully going to be published in August. But here's the buckets kind of reorganized from a kind of a micro to a macro level. So from the ground floor of patient communication, and increasing data complexity, right? Here you have a one-to-one kind of situation, all the way up to population health and managing huge, vast amounts of data. So these are prompt examples you can maybe test out or think about, but this is just to give examples so it's more concrete. So for patient communication, you could say something like, translate this Spanish radiology report for me into English, explain its recommendations to me at a 6th grade reading level, right? Very doable. You can try it right now. It's a possible thing. For radiology training and education, you could think of something like, any creative ideas to teach about this case of anastomosing hemangioma, please cite sources. This gets a little hairy, and I'm sure people who have used ChatGPT have realized source citing may not be the best thing that for it, because it's not really connected to real internet, and for a lot of things that are newer, it's not able to do that, and it can hallucinate sources. We'll talk about that more later. For radiology clinical practice, you can say a 0.8 centimeter solid pulmonary nodule, and then it should, in theory, autofill in Fleischner, either within the report where you're free texting, but also again at the end and auto-generating everything. In fact, there's even already, I think, in production, or if not in active production, places that are considering saying, just free dictate what you ever need to dictate, and it will just generate the whole report. And for referring services in the healthcare system, based on input data, give a treatment plan or recommendation for patient X. That this is definitely in progress of investigation for many people, and it remains to be seen how accurate it is. For population health, how many cases of COVID are happening in New York City this week? This is not currently possible. It remains to be seen how possible it will be in the future. We can discuss that also. And given those examples, you can see I've listed a couple other categories to think about. Green is under active testing, on active evaluation, active research. You can possibly foresee this within the next couple of years. Early research development, this is more theoretical, and people may be thinking about it, unclear whether or not that will be in the next couple of years or later. And then red is absolutely not possible yet, but just kind of as a fun thinking tool. So again, thinking about report reading level communication, educational tools to just kind of educate patients of what to expect during their exam, or even post-exam following up with them. Radiology training and education, this is a little interesting because I'm sure you've all seen that ChatGPT passed the USMLE. That does a lot of different things in thinking about, is it smarter or smart enough than a human counterpart, and what does that mean in terms of smartness? And here, it's a little different in that the teaching assistant, right? Like, if it's able to pass a test, is it able to teach you, and is it accurate? And if it can generate enough content for you, so let's just say an endless USMLE bank, how could that help your test taking? And could it and if it was able to then, in theory, store that data, let's just say you keep messing up on questions on a certain category, is it able to store that and regenerate things? That would be very interesting. I know Khan Academy is also already thinking about integrating ChatGPT and other generative AI and other teaching type things, teaching type websites are considering integrating more of ChatGPT type resources. It might also suggest resources for further study. You can already ask ChatGPT, design a curriculum for me, and it would do that for you. I think this was just a hypothetical for radiologists to consider. Consider your board exam right now not being really accurate and reflective of your day-to-day work, right? And just thinking about that, it's because people can't grade you and they can't read all of your reports. But what if it could? What if it could really just have you dictate a normal day's work, or but with a preset standard of exams, and it could just grade you based on that because it could read everything? I think that would be very fascinating. There's a lot of applications there that I think would be better for us and for patients, but just something to think about. Oops, sorry. And then here for clinical practice, we already kind of talked about this. The automated secretary is an interesting point in terms of, I think phone calls and things that affect radiologist burnout, I think are low hanging fruit in a way, but would take a lot of effort because it's not immediately gratifying. Maybe you're not making a very shiny generative AI thing, but it's very useful. And I think it's an area worth investigating, to think about how could we reduce phone calls and automate things to help radiologists kind of feel better at work, and clinical decision support to kind of reduce all these extra fill-ins and everything else to kind of also keep people up to date, and make sure that people practice to the top of evidence-based medicine. This is interesting in that I saw a paper out recently about tumor boards for referring services. Somebody's already thinking about how do we integrate all the different modalities of data throughout the Epic EMR and everything else. And thinking about clinical decision support and also data interoperability as you kind of send data between systems, right? If you can ask it to do that and kind of smooth in that process when everyone's saying it's so difficult, my IT system can't do that. Well, ask ChatGPT to figure that out. And then this is fascinating in its own way, because this would be Batman style of it plugging yourself into way too much data and access that this would be a little too scary and probably not possible. But it'd be very interesting ethically to think about that. There is ways of retrospectively analyzing. There's a paper on that, analyzing public health scenarios where you analyze how people handled, for example, monkeypox, and see if things could have been done differently, and what ChatGPT could recommend new research directions or things like that. So there's a lot of pitfalls in all of these areas. I'm not going to read all of these pieces to you, as I think I'm running a bit out of time, but I think it's just interesting to think about areas, not just the potential and of within the healthcare system, but also ways that we should consider how it may fail, and areas of research that really need to be investigated before any of these things can be deployed. So I'm just going to highlight those papers just so you're aware, and you can talk about that further with colleagues in the future. There was a paper out by Dr. Paul Yee's team at University of Maryland that was discussing the appropriateness of breast cancer prevention screening recommendations provided by ChatGPT. You can read this paper in Radiology. It was published in April. This was the paper that I mentioned briefly earlier, was the tumor board paper. It's not peer reviewed quite yet. It's not quite published, but this was an interesting figure that they were discussing integrating all these modalities in and develop a plan. They did test, I think, 8 patients, which is a very low number, but it's worth just looking at just as a pilot study. They said it did poorly in classifying glioma subtypes, but was good for adjuvant treatment recommendations, which is amazing. And the field continues to evolve. Microsoft and Epic, for example, have recently partnered, and so you might see things unfolding very rapidly. I will briefly mention that we do need to think about how these predictions are done in areas of diversity, and in affecting structurally marginalized groups. So you can see that this is an automatic fill-in, not necessarily related to generative AI, just language. And you can see that this fill-in, unfortunately, is biased and states some very shocking things. So this is a quote from Dr. Tully Whitney. She's one of the co-founders of the Grace Hopper Institute. Diversity drives innovation, and when we limit who can contribute, we limit what problems we can solve. So really thinking about this as we go further into generative AI, to think about this at the ground level and build upwards from there. So as the hype builds, generative AI, we're still on that peak of expectations and innovation trigger. So we haven't quite gone through that trough of disillusionment and beyond, but I'm glad we're able to discuss it now together and think about this as we progress along this hype cycle. So again, re-highlighting that we're moving towards this machine intelligence. So here's a fun comic to end with, just from Midjourney, where this worker says, "I'm always on time. Johnson, AI is replacing your job, but can you be a prompt engineer?" I just think that was really adorable, because, you know, as generative AI progresses, you are not necessarily going to lose your job, but you're going to be asked to do things within generative AI, to do things that generative AI could help speed up. So yes, thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, please contact me. I'll be moving over to Maryland in July 1st.